New Zealand is a very economically free country by global standards, and I want to tell the story about when the line went up, when things improved, because I think probably quite a lot of you don't know, and it's a remarkable story. Up until 1984, New Zealand was economically very, very unfree. I was a teenager living there at that point. And just to give you a flavor of it, it was illegal in New Zealand to transport anything, any goods, more than 150 miles in a truck. Why was that? Why was it illegal to do that? Well, that was to protect the railways. So you were forced, effectively, to ship your goods on a train rather than a truck. If you wanted to buy something from overseas, and you had to buy a lot of things from overseas because New Zealand's a small country that doesn't produce much except agricultural things, you needed permission from the government to buy it because you needed to get the money, the foreign exchange, and you needed government permission for that. But you had to account for yourself. So I know a man who's wanted to buy a book. He just wanted to buy a book. He had to explain why he wanted that book. Why wasn't there a better book he could have got from New Zealand? When you went on a holiday overseas, you had to send your tickets to the government, and it would show when you were leaving and when you were coming back. And they had a daily allowance for how much foreign currency you were allowed per day while you were away, but it wasn't very much. And so if you wanted to have a nice holiday, you couldn't afford it. You couldn't do it. You couldn't get enough money for it. So what New Zealanders used to do is buy gold chain, put it around their necks as if it was jewelry, and when they got overseas, they'd sell it so that they could pay for their holiday. It's really, I mean, I can't explain to you how controlled the economy was. You couldn't import anything without a license from the government. Getting the license, once you got the license and it was exclusive, you could immediately get very rich. And so there was a lot of bribery and corruption going on to get these licenses. Now, what happened? How did this change? Well, in 1972, Great Britain joined the European Union. And this put an end to the basic economic model of New Zealand. New Zealand's economy had been based on, basically New Zealand was a farm for Britain. It would produce lamb and milk and butter and all that kind of thing, and the British would buy it all. I think something like 95% of New Zealand exports went to Great Britain. Well, Britain joined the European Union. The French said, we're not having this. They put quotas on, and the New Zealand economy went downhill very rapidly. In fact, from 1972 to 1984, there was no economic growth at all in New Zealand, flat for 12 years. This led, and the government of the time just kept increasing and increasing the economic controls. The reaction was more and more authoritarianism. It was actually becoming quite alarming, the tone of the country. The Prime Minister was a little thug of a man called Robert Muldoon, and he was becoming increasingly tyrannical. A new political party started up that I was a member of called the New Zealand Party. This was in 1983 it started. Very rapidly, it got up to 15% in the polls, and the Prime Minister panicked and called a snap election, an early election. He was drunk at the time. If you want to see footage of it, you look it up on YouTube. When he announces that he's having a new election, he's visibly drunk. Anyway, so he called this election. The party that I was a member of, this party called the New Zealand Party, had a very economically liberal agenda. We didn't win, of course, we were a new party, but the Labour Party won. And oddly enough, the Labour Party enacted radical economic liberalisation. They almost immediately, I mean, I've got to explain how radical this was. All of the changes I'm about to describe to you happened within about 2 years. They abolished all the agricultural subsidies. Now, this was huge in a country whose economy is based on agriculture. It had fantastic effects. I'll get to some of the other changes soon, and this is important in Europe, where the common agricultural policy should be abandoned immediately. Here's what happened. The government had used to pay farmers a subsidy per sheep or per cow. The effect of this was to have a lot of sheep that were very skinny, right? Because you got paid not for the production, not for the meat, but per sheep. When they removed the subsidy, the number of sheep in New Zealand reduced from 80 million. There were 80 million sheep and 4 million people. 80 million sheep, it went down to about, it halved roughly. but the output of meat stayed exactly the same. The amount of land being used by sheep farmers, of course, reduced. When there's a subsidy, you farm sheep anywhere. You don't care, even on places that are really bad for farming sheep. That stopped, and the New Zealand wine industry began, because people started realizing this land is no good for sheep farming, it's actually better for wine, for grapes. Within about 2 years, the New Zealand agricultural sector went from being quite inefficient to, I think, the most efficient in the world. That happened in 2 years. They removed the exchange controls, so you could freely move money in and out of the country. The exchange rate was floated. They removed all tariffs on imports, almost all. So New Zealand is a country that has unilateral free trade. People may impose tariffs on our stuff when we export it to them, but we don't retaliate. All imports come in without tariffs. And we had compulsory unionism. So if you got a job in a certain company, you were obliged by law to join the union. That got rid of a little later, but that was part of the process. You could see the change, and this is actually to your point, Fred. The changes were visible, not just in the economic statistics, but in the country. It was like a weight had been lifted from the population. You can't believe the transformation in the culture of New Zealand between 1984 and, let's say, 1990. In 1984, it felt a little bit like a country behind the Iron Curtain. Everything was grey and dull. There was no innovation. There were no restaurants, and there was no artistic production. And suddenly it exploded, and it became a much better place to live. And most tellingly, you could see the change in the economy, because New Zealand is a small country, 4.5 million people. The economic centre of New Zealand is Auckland. That's the biggest city. It's now got about 1.5 million people. The capital is in Wellington, which is a smaller city. It's about 350,000 people. Up until 1984, all the head offices of all the big companies were in Wellington. After 1984, when the government got out of the economy, all the head offices moved to Auckland. You can see the symbolism, right? It didn't matter. You didn't need to be close to politicians anymore, because politicians weren't doing you favors. You needed to be nearer your customers. And that migration was kind of symbolic of the change in the economy. So we had this fantastic period of economic reforms going from 1984 up until the early 1990s. Then something changed. And what changed is partly the electoral system. New Zealand went from having the British electoral system, first past the post, so where you get two parties, basically, and one has a temporary kind of dictatorship, you might say, during the electoral term. We went from that to proportional representation. Once we had a proportional representation system, you always get coalition governments. And the coalition partners constrain each other. And it's not just that, the constraints are also that you, as a political party, you know that at the next election you may need to form a new coalition, so you tend to be more mild, more moderate, so that you can do business with your political opponents in the future. So the economic reform program of liberalisation stopped roughly in the mid-1990s. However, it had gone a long way, and New Zealand had become, by that point, a very economically free country. What's happening now? I'll just briefly tell you why there may be some cause for concern. The good part of the story is that proportional representation came in and stopped reform when New Zealand was already very free. So there's been some backpedaling, but it's been moderate. The backpedaling has been in, unfortunately, crony capitalism to some extent. The government now directs a lot of money towards its favoured businesses. This took off under the previous National Party, which is supposed to be a centre-right party, that a lot of taxpayers' money is now directed towards private businesses who can convince politicians that it's a good investment. The labour laws have been tightened up again, so it's now harder than it used to be to fire somebody. There is more in the way of health and safety regulations than there used to be. Government spending has increased on what I would call middle-class welfare, so university students now are treated very nicely by the government. You don't have to pay for your university education effectively. It costs you about 12, in euros, what would it be? It would be about, it would cost you about 20,000 euros to get a degree, even though the actual cost of providing it is about 100,000 euros. And there's been a lot of regulation in banking of the kind that's universal around the world. If you want a senior job in a bank in New Zealand, you have to get permission from the Reserve Bank. So that the Reserve Bank actually decides who can and cannot hold jobs in banks. But the biggest problem in New Zealand, and the biggest threat to the prosperity of the people, comes from something, unfortunately, that was done by that reforming government, the Labour government of the late 80s. And it's called the Resource Management Act. This is the regulatory system that governs the use of land in New Zealand. It is unbelievably restrictive. It's very, very difficult to buy land and develop it for residential property and for other commercial purposes. And the effect of this is, you will find this hard to believe, but New Zealand is a country bigger than Great Britain. Great Britain has a population of something in the order of 65 million. New Zealand has a population of about 4.5 million, and yet we have a land shortage. There is a shortage of land for residential development. This shortage is created entirely by regulation. And it means that in Auckland, for example, where the bulk of the population lives, the price of a house, the average house price, is 10 times the average annual income. In the 1970s, it was 3 times the average annual income. And this is causing a great economic hardship for New Zealanders, and it's stunting economic growth in all sorts of ways. And this is the biggest challenge for New Zealand policymakers, to get rid of this thing. Unfortunately, it has a kind of sacred status in New Zealand. New Zealand is very attached to the place. It's a very beautiful place. And it's very easy to get political support for things that protect the environment. But the problem is that protecting the environment, the cost of it is massive. And the greatest challenge for any government is to overcome this. Unfortunately, we just have a new government in New Zealand. It's a coalition of the Labour Party and the Green Party and a kind of fascist party. And between the three of them, they ain't going to overturn this regulation.